A millionaire found a homeless boy asleep on the toilet seat in his hotel. He helped the boy until he discovered that the boy had brought something terrible into the hotel. The hum of the hotel lobby was a steady murmur, punctuated by the rhythmic clinking of glasses from the bar and the muffled laughter of guests fresh from a night out. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft glow across polished marble floors, their reflection shimmering like liquid gold. Jeremy Howard walked through the space with measured steps, his sharp gaze sweeping over every detail. A crease in the carpet near the reception desk, a waiter adjusting his tie too often, a concierge who smiled a little too mechanically. Nothing slipped past him. He thrived on precision. Every chair in his hotels had to be angled just so, every table set to perfection. His properties weren't just places to stay. They were symphonies of service, where each detail composed the melody of luxury. But something felt off tonight. He couldn't pinpoint what. His steps led him to the side hallway near the lobby, where a staff-only entrance led toward the kitchens, storage rooms, and the lesser-used restrooms. It was quieter here, the sounds of the lobby muffled. Jeremy rarely checked this area himself. His managers handled it. But tonight, something made him veer off his usual path. The restroom door swung open smoothly at his touch. The air inside was cooler, tinged with the scent of freshly mopped floors and faint traces of aftershave. His gaze flicked over the gleaming tiles, the row of sinks, the motionless stalls. Then he saw them. A pair of small, dirt-caked sneakers, the soles peeling at the edges, barely visible beneath the last stall door. Jeremy stopped. He wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but instincts, sharpened over years of reading people and situations, told him this wasn't right. He took a step closer, the soft echo of his Italian leather shoes bouncing off the tiled walls. He knocked lightly. No response. Frowning, he pushed the door open. Curled up against the toilet, arms wrapped around himself as though bracing against a cold only he could feel, was a boy. A child, maybe 8 or 9, too small for his age, his frame almost swallowed by an oversized hoodie that had long since lost its color. His face was turned into the fabric of his sleeves, his breathing shallow, his knees drawn up tightly. Jeremy crouched, exhaling slowly. "Hey," he said, his voice low, even. The boy stirred, his entire body tensing in an instant. Dark eyes, sharp, wary, snapped open, darting toward the door like a cornered animal searching for escape. Jeremy raised a hand, palm open. "It's okay," he said. "You're not in trouble." The boy's breath quickened. His fingers twitched, gripping his sleeves tighter. He looked like he was calculating how fast he could run, how long before he'd be caught. Jeremy, who had negotiated billion-dollar deals and faced down corporate sharks, knew when words were useless. He didn't ask the boy why he was here. He didn't ask him to explain. He simply sat back on his heels, waiting. The boy didn't move. A long, silent minute passed. Then another. Jeremy finally exhaled and pulled his phone from his pocket, tapping out a message. A moment later, the door eased open, and a uniformed staff member stepped inside, carrying a neatly folded bundle of clothes. Behind her, a bellboy held a tray, warm soup, a sandwich, and a bottle of water. The boy's gaze flickered between them. His lips parted slightly as the scent of food reached him. Jeremy noticed. He took the tray from the bellboy and set it on the floor, just within reach, before leaning back against the tiled wall. "Eat," he said simply. The boy hesitated. Then, slowly, hesitantly, he reached out, his fingers closing around the sandwich. He didn't devour it. He took small, measured bites, chewing carefully, as if expecting it to be taken away. Jeremy said nothing. When the sandwich was gone, the boy took the water but didn't open it right away. He looked at Jeremy, his voice hoarse from disuse when he finally spoke. "Why?" Jeremy tilted his head. Why, what? Why are you helping me? The billionaire studied him for a moment. There were many answers he could give. He could say it was because he owned this hotel, and a child sleeping in its restroom was unacceptable. He could say it was because he had once been young and hungry too, though his past was a story locked behind walls few could breach. Instead, he said, "Because you need it." The boy looked at him for a long time, weighing the words as if testing their truth. Then, slowly, he unscrewed the water bottle cap and took a sip. Jeremy stood and held out the fresh clothes. "Let's get you cleaned up, then we'll figure things out." The boy didn't take them at first, but after another long pause, he reached out. His fingers brushed the fabric, hesitant, as if expecting some kind of trick. When none came, he took the clothes and clutched them to his chest. Jeremy nodded toward the sinks. "Go on, I'll wait." The boy's eyes flicked to the exit, then back to Jeremy. And then, cautiously, warily, he stood and walked toward the sink. Jeremy watched him in the mirror's reflection, watched as the boy turned on the faucet, cupped the water and let it run over his face. The grime softened, washing away in slow, uneven streaks. The boy met his own reflection, studied the sunken cheeks, the too thin arms, the unfamiliar sight of himself in a place he did not belong. Jeremy recognized that look. A lifetime ago, he had worn it too. Building hotels and running a service business taught him to be kind and gentle with everyone, even if they weren't customers. As the boy scrubbed his face with trembling fingers, Jeremy leaned against the counter and sent another text to his assistant. "Bring the car around. We're not leaving him here." The evening air was thick with the scent of rain, the streets still damp from an earlier drizzle. The glow of streetlights shimmered in puddles, distorting reflections of passing cars. Jeremy's hotel loomed in the background, its pristine facade untouched by the city's grittier edges. He walked at an unhurried pace, his strides measured, his thoughts sharper than usual. The boy followed a step behind, quiet but alert, his small frame barely making a sound against the pavement. Jeremy had seen this before, the wariness of someone accustomed to being chased away, to being invisible when necessary, and painfully noticed when it was least convenient. They reached the restaurant's entrance, its warm interior casting a welcoming glow against the cool night. Juan hesitated, his eyes flicking to the polished glass doors, then to Jeremy. Jeremy didn't rush him. He simply pulled the door open and walked inside, trusting the boy to follow. The dining room was modest compared to the luxury of Jeremy's hotel, but it had a certain charm. The low hum of conversation, the clinking of silverware, and the comforting aroma of grilled meat and freshly baked bread filled the air. Juan lingered at the threshold for a second too long, before slipping inside, shoulders tight. Jeremy led him to a booth in the farthest corner, where the lighting was dimmer and the space more private. Juan sat stiffly, his small hands resting on the edge of the table, as if bracing himself to be told to leave. A waitress approached, her notepad ready. "Something warm for the kid," Jeremy said, handing her the menu without looking at it. "And the special for me." Juan's fingers twitched. He didn't speak, but his eyes tracked every movement. How the waitress jotted down the order, how Jeremy leaned back against the booth, how the other patrons ate without a second thought. Minutes passed in silence. Juan's gaze flicked to the breadbasket the waitress had left on the table. "Go ahead," Jeremy said casually. The boy hesitated. Then, with careful fingers, he took a piece. He didn't eat it right away. Instead, he held it in both hands, as if weighing his options. Then, slowly, he tore off a small chunk and slipped it into his pocket. Jeremy pretended not to notice. Their food arrived, a steaming bowl of stew for Juan, thick with meat and vegetables. His grip on the spoon was too tight, his movements too measured, slow, cautious bites, as if expecting the meal to disappear before he could finish. Jeremy didn't speak. Instead, he let the weight of silence settle between them, let the quiet stretch until it felt less like a trap and more like space. Halfway through the meal, Juan's chewing slowed. "I don't steal," he said suddenly, voice barely above a whisper. Jeremy set down his fork. "I didn't say you did." Juan kept his eyes on the table. "I don't." A pause. Then, "I just take what I need." Jeremy studied him. There was no defensiveness in his tone, just a quiet resignation. "I get it," Jeremy said simply. Juan swallowed, his grip tightening around the spoon. He nodded once, but he didn't seem convinced. They finished eating in silence. When the waitress returned with the bill, Jeremy handed her his card and pushed the remaining bread toward Juan without a word. The boy hesitated only for a second before pocketing another piece. They stepped outside. The air was crisper now, the city quieter. Juan stood beside him on the sidewalk, his small hands buried in the sleeves of his too big hoodie. He glanced up once, uncertain. Jeremy met his gaze. "You need a place to sleep," he said. "Come with me." Juan's shoulders tensed. His expression didn't change, but Jeremy could see the thoughts racing behind those dark eyes. "I don't need—" "No conditions," Jeremy interrupted. "Just a place to rest. That's all. Obviously you need this." Juan hesitated, shifting on his feet. Then, finally, he nodded. Jeremy didn't say anything else. He simply started walking. And this time, Juan followed without hesitation. The city blurred into streaks of amber and red as Jeremy's car slid through the quiet streets, the hum of the engine steady against the hush of the night. Raindrops clung to the windshield, catching the glow of passing headlights before sliding into oblivion. In the seat beside him, Juan sat rigid, his thin frame swallowed by the plush leather, hands tucked into the sleeves of his hoodie. Jeremy didn't speak. Neither did Juan. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. More like a fragile truce, an unspoken agreement that words weren't necessary just yet. When they pulled into the long, winding driveway, Juan's fingers curled tighter around his sleeves. The house, more estate than home, loomed ahead, its silhouette framed by manicured hedges and dim garden lights. The wrought iron gate had opened at the first scan of Jeremy's license plate, and now the car rolled to a smooth stop beneath the portico. The driver stepped out first, reaching for the door, but Jeremy lifted a hand, stopping him. Juan hadn't moved. He stared at the grand entrance, the massive double doors, the tall arched windows reflecting the night sky. Jeremy unbuckled his seatbelt and pushed open his door. "Come on," he said, voice even. Juan hesitated, then followed. Inside, the house was quiet, the air filled with the faint scent of polished wood and something warm. Vanilla, maybe, or cinnamon. A staff member appeared from the hallway, but Jeremy shook his head slightly. No need to overwhelm the boy. Juan took a step forward, then another, his eyes darting over the high ceilings, the gleaming floors, the framed artwork lining the walls. But he didn't linger. He didn't touch anything. He kept his shoulders hunched, his hands deep in his pockets. Jeremy led him past the grand staircase, bypassing the main living areas entirely. He had no intention of parading the kid through his home like a guest at a gala. Instead, he took him directly to a smaller, quieter wing, one that felt less intimidating, more livable. "This is your room," Jeremy said, pushing open a door. Juan stepped inside cautiously. The guest room was understated compared to the rest of the house. Soft grey walls, a neatly made bed, a desk, a dresser. A window overlooked the garden, where dim lanterns cast a warm glow over the trimmed hedges and stone pathways. Juan stood in the center of the room, motionless. Jeremy leaned against the doorframe. "Bathroom's through there," he gestured. "Fresh clothes in the dresser. You can shower, eat, sleep, whatever you need." Juan didn't look at him. His hands twitched slightly at his sides, his breathing steady but a little too careful, as if bracing for something. Jeremy had seen this before, the instinct to not take up space, to not ask for too much. He pushed away from the door. Good night. He left the hallway light on. Jeremy woke at 2 a.m. to the soft creak of floorboards. The security system had already registered movement in the guest wing, but Jeremy hadn't needed the alert. Something had stirred him awake, something just out of place enough to pull him from the edges of sleep. He didn't move right away. He listened. Soft footsteps, barely there. Hesitant. He got up and made his way down the hall, his own steps slow, deliberate. When he reached the guest room, he found the door slightly ajar. Juan was awake. The boy stood near the window, his outline barely visible in the faint glow of the garden lights. His hands were curled into the hem of his hoodie, his shoulders drawn up as if he was waiting for someone to catch him in the act of simply existing. Jeremy exhaled through his nose. He didn't speak. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his chest. Juan tensed, sensing the presence behind him. "You should be sleeping," Jeremy said after a moment. Juan flinched slightly, but didn't turn around. "I don't sleep much." His voice was quiet, but steady. Jeremy didn't press. "You don't have to stay in here all night, you know," he said instead. "If you need air, take a walk in the garden. If you're hungry, the kitchen's open." Juan was silent for a long time. Then, finally, "I'm not hungry." Jeremy nodded, even though the boy wasn't looking at him. "Okay," he said simply. He didn't tell Juan to go back to bed. He didn't tell him what to do. He just stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked away, leaving the door slightly open behind him. Morning came slow and grey, the sky overcast, the air damp from lingering rain. Jeremy was already at the kitchen table when Juan finally appeared, his movements quiet, but no longer as hesitant. The boy stopped at the threshold, his gaze flicking toward the food laid out on the counter. Fresh toast, eggs, fruit, coffee for Jeremy, juice for him. Jeremy didn't look up from the newspaper he was scanning. "Help yourself," he said casually. Juan lingered. Then, slowly, he made his way to the table. He poured himself a glass of juice, took a slice of toast, and sat. They ate in silence. After a few minutes, Jeremy set his newspaper down. "You ever watch football?" Juan blinked at him. The question had come out of nowhere, unexpected, with no deeper meaning attached to it. "Sometimes," the boy answered. Jeremy nodded. "Chicago Bears fan." Juan wrinkled his nose. "No." Jeremy smirked slightly. "Good." A small pause. Then, "I like the Cowboys," Juan muttered, almost like a confession. Jeremy raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. Instead, he took a sip of his coffee. "They've got a decent lineup this season." Juan shrugged, chewing his toast. The conversation ended there, but something had shifted, barely noticeable, like the first ripple across still water. Later that afternoon, Jeremy found Juan by the koi pond. The boy was crouched near the edge, watching the fish move lazily through the water, his expression unreadable. The garden was quiet, the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine hanging in the air. Jeremy didn't say anything right away. He stood a few steps away, observing. "You like them?" he asked eventually. Juan nodded. "They say koi fish can swim upstream against the current," Jeremy mused. "That's why they symbolize resilience." Juan glanced at him, eyes thoughtful. "Do they ever stop swimming?" Jeremy tilted his head. "Number. If they stop, they sink." Juan looked back at the water. His fingers twitched slightly against the fabric of his hoodie. Jeremy let the silence linger. Some things didn't need to be said out loud. The city was beginning to stir as Jeremy pulled up in front of the hotel. The early morning haze still clung to the streets, the distant hum of traffic breaking through the stillness. He stepped out of the car, stretching slightly as he glanced over at Juan, who lingered by the entrance. The boy's hands were buried deep in the sleeves of his hoodie, his frame still small against the vastness of the building towering above them. Jeremy had never been one to coddle, nor was he the type to pry, but Juan's silence was different. It wasn't defiant or indifferent. It was careful, calculated, like someone who had learned that words could sometimes cost more than they were worth. He pushed open the door to the hotel, walking in without looking back. After a second, Juan followed. The lobby was quieter at this hour, with only a few guests checking out, their voices hushed as they exchanged keys and final pleasantries with the front desk staff. Juan kept his distance, his eyes flicking around the room, taking everything in: the chandelier that reflected golden light across the polished floors, the bellboys moving efficiently, the guests whose entire lives fit neatly into expensive suitcases. Jeremy pretended not to notice. Instead, he turned to the concierge. "Let's take a walk," he said, nodding toward the back hallways. Juan hesitated, then trailed after him. They passed through the employee corridors, where the walls were lined with storage units and hotel carts. Juan's steps slowed slightly as they approached the service entrance, where a bellboy was loading a set of bags onto a trolley. Jeremy caught the way Juan's eyes lingered. "You ever carry luggage before?" he asked casually. Juan glanced up, wary. "Yeah." Jeremy gestured toward the bellboy. "Want to try?" For a moment, Juan seemed unsure if it was a test, but after a beat, he stepped forward and reached for one of the smaller bags. It was heavier than he expected, but he adjusted quickly, shifting it onto the trolley with practiced ease. The bellboy gave him a curious glance, but didn't comment, simply nodding in approval. Jeremy watched in silence. As they moved toward the main hallway, Juan stayed close, his posture slightly more relaxed than before. Jeremy led him toward the cafe, where they found a quiet booth in the corner. The space was warm, the scent of fresh pastries filling the air. The morning rush hadn't started yet, leaving the atmosphere peaceful, unhurried. Juan sat stiffly, his fingers curling against the table's edge. Jeremy ordered 2 coffees, then added an extra plate of toast and eggs. Juan didn't protest. Minutes passed in quiet. Then, finally, Juan spoke. "I climbed through the bathroom window," he said suddenly, his voice low but steady. "That's how I got in." Jeremy set his coffee down. He didn't react, didn't interrupt. He just let the boy talk. "I wasn't planning to stay long. Just wanted to find something to eat," Juan continued, his eyes fixed on the table. "But there were too many people in the lobby, too many cameras. I thought maybe if I waited until it got late enough, I could slip out without anyone noticing." His fingers tightened slightly around his sleeves. "I didn't mean to fall asleep." Jeremy nodded, his expression unreadable. "And before that?" Juan exhaled, his shoulders sinking slightly. "Before that, I lived with my aunt and uncle." He said it like it was a fact, like it was something that existed, but held no weight. Jeremy waited. "They weren't good people," Juan finally admitted. His voice was quieter now, more careful. "I don't think they ever wanted me there. They only kept me because they had to." Jeremy didn't press, but the silence that followed carried its own kind of weight. "They used to make me run errands," Juan continued, his jaw tightening. "At first it was small stuff, just deliveries. I didn't ask what was inside. But after a while I started noticing things." His hands curled into fists. "I think they were dealing drugs. I don't know for sure, but they always had people coming over. And sometimes they'd get mad if I asked too many questions." Jeremy watched the boy's expression shift, his voice remaining calm, but his body betraying the tension underneath. "One night, Tyler hit me," Juan said, so quietly it was almost an afterthought. "I don't even remember why, but that's when I knew I couldn't stay." Jeremy's fingers drummed lightly against the table, the only outward sign that he was processing the information. "You ran," he said. Juan nodded. "I waited until they were asleep. Took some cash I found in the kitchen and left." His lips pressed together. "I didn't have anywhere to go." Jeremy let the silence stretch between them. Then, finally, he spoke. "You did the right thing." Juan's gaze flicked up, searching his face for any sign of doubt or judgment. But Jeremy's expression was steady, unwavering. "I don't know what happens next," Juan admitted after a long pause. Jeremy leaned back in his chair. "We figure that out when we get there." Juan didn't respond right away, but something in his posture shifted, just slightly, but enough for Jeremy to notice. They finished breakfast in silence. That evening, they sat outside in the garden, the sky painted in fading shades of amber and violet. The air was crisp, carrying the distant scent of rain from the streets beyond the estate's gates. Juan sat on the edge of the koi pond, watching as the fish moved lazily through the water. He had been quiet since their conversation that morning, but not in a way that felt guarded. It was a different kind of silence, one that came from processing rather than hiding. Jeremy took a seat on the bench nearby, stretching his legs out in front of him. "You ever have a plan?" Juan asked suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. Jeremy glanced at him. "What do you mean?" Juan didn't look away from the water. "When you were younger, did you know what you wanted to do?" Jeremy considered the question for a moment. "Not exactly, but I knew what I didn't want." Juan frowned slightly. "Which was?" Jeremy exhaled. "I didn't want to be the guy who let the world tell him where he belonged." Juan's fingers twitched slightly against his knee. He didn't respond right away, but Jeremy could tell he was turning the words over in his mind. A long pause stretched between them. Then, "Do you think people like me get to decide that?" Juan asked quietly. Jeremy's gaze didn't waver. "I think people like you decide that every day." Juan finally looked at him, something unreadable flickering behind his dark eyes. Jeremy stood in his study, the evening light stretching long shadows across the mahogany desk. A glass of whiskey sat untouched beside his laptop, the amber liquid catching the glow of his desk lamp. His fingers rested against his chin, his mind working through the problem in front of him. Juan's words from the cafe echoed in his head. They weren't good people. They only kept me because they had to. Jeremy had known it from the moment he saw Juan curled up in that restroom, the way the boy had flinched at sudden movements, the way he hesitated before reaching for food, the way silence wrapped around him like armor. He wasn't just a lost child. He was a boy who had learned not to expect kindness. And now, the weight of responsibility pressed against Jeremy's chest. He had no legal claim to Juan. If Kayla and Tyler decided to report him for taking the boy in, it could spiral into something messy, something that could result in Juan being sent back to the very people who had failed him. That was not an option. Jeremy needed proof. Not assumptions, not suspicions, hard evidence that Kayla and Tyler were unfit guardians. Something irrefutable that he could hand over to Child Protective Services, ensuring Juan's safety without a legal battle. His phone sat within reach. He picked it up, scrolling through his contacts until he found the one he was looking for. Elliot Reed, private investigator, discreet, efficient, a man who knew how to work between the lines of legality without ever stepping too far out of bounds. Jeremy tapped the call button and waited. "Jeremy," Elliot's voice came through, sharp as ever. "It's been a while. I need you to look into someone," Jeremy said without preamble. "Kayla and Tyler Morgan. They have custody of a child, Juan." "Got it. What am I looking for?" "Proof they aren't fit to raise him." Jeremy's voice was even, but there was a rare edge to it. "I want solid evidence. Neglect, abuse, anything that can ensure child services will take custody. This needs to be airtight." A pause. Then, "Understood. Give me a couple of days." Jeremy ended the call and set the phone down, exhaling slowly. He had done what he could. Now, he waited. Days passed in a slow, uneasy rhythm. Juan was unaware of the investigation, and Jeremy had no intention of telling him. The boy was already carrying enough weight on his small shoulders. There was no need to add more. Instead, Jeremy kept him occupied, bringing him along for errands, letting him trail behind as he moved through his daily routine. At a cafe one morning, Juan reached for a sugar packet, slipping it into his pocket without thinking. Jeremy didn't react, but later that evening, he left a box of snacks on Juan's dresser. A quiet way of saying, "You don't have to do that anymore." Juan never acknowledged it, but the next time they went out, his hands stayed at his sides. Small progress. Elliot called 3 days later. "Got something for you," he said, his voice steady but with an edge of tension. "You were right to be concerned." Jeremy didn't ask questions over the phone. He simply told Elliot to meet him at his office. "Leave a comment, yogurt, if you're hearing this important detail." When the investigator arrived, he carried a slim folder, the kind that didn't look like much, but could unravel lives with its contents. "You wanted proof." Elliot slid the folder across the desk. "This is more than enough." Jeremy opened it. Inside were surveillance photos, Kayla and Tyler in darkened alleyways, exchanging packages with men whose faces were half hidden beneath the glow of streetlights. Financial records show deposits of cash in irregular amounts, with no employment to justify the income. And the worst of it, photos of Juan, caught in the periphery, carrying small envelopes, his face turned away, unaware of what he was delivering. Jeremy's grip on the folder tightened. "They used him," he said, his voice even. Elliot nodded. "And not just him. Looks like they've been dealing for a while, and some of their clients." He tapped one of the photos. "Frequent your hotel." Jeremy's eyes flicked over the images. Some of the men he recognized, not just as patrons, but as VIP guests, men who came with money, with influence, the kind who booked entire floors for their private affairs. His stomach curled in disgust. If drugs were being moved through his property, even unknowingly, the consequences could be catastrophic. But first, he had to deal with Juan's situation. "Is this enough to make sure Juan never goes back to them?" Jeremy asked. Elliot exhaled. This will make sure they never see a kid again, period." Jeremy nodded once. "Send it to CPS. I'll handle the rest." That evening, Jeremy returned home late. He found Juan in the living room, curled up in an armchair, with a book resting on his lap. The boy didn't acknowledge him at first, but his eyes flickered toward him, cautious. Jeremy walked past him, setting his briefcase down. "Dinner's in the kitchen if you're hungry." Juan hesitated, then nodded. Jeremy studied him from the corner of his eye. Something about Juan's posture was different, more watchful. The kid had good instincts. "You okay?" Jeremy asked casually. Juan shrugged. "You're acting weird." Jeremy smirked slightly. "Weird how?" Juan narrowed his eyes, but didn't push further. He just leaned back into the chair, pulling his hoodie tighter around himself. Jeremy didn't press either. He simply walked past, ruffling the boy's hair lightly as he passed. Juan huffed, but didn't pull away. The next morning, Jeremy made the call. "Child Protective Services," a woman's voice answered. Jeremy leaned back in his chair, his grip firm around his pen. "I have information regarding the welfare of a minor under the custody of Kayla and Tyler Morgan," he said. "I'd like to submit a report." And just like that, the first step was in motion. The conference room buzzed with tension, the kind that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. The hotel's top executives, managers, and security heads sat around the long mahogany table, their faces reflecting a mix of concern and unease. Jeremy stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding as he placed his palms flat against the surface. "Effective immediately, I want a full review of all high-profile guests," he said, his voice low but firm. "Every booking, every request, every unusual expense flagged for further investigation. If drugs are moving through my hotel, I want to know about it." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, but before anyone could speak, The door burst open. A breathless hotel staff member rushed inside, her face pale with panic. "Sir," she gasped, her voice trembling. "There's an emergency in suite 1902. One of our guests, he's unresponsive." Jeremy's stomach clenched. "Who?" "Mr. Green," she whispered. "The son of—" Jeremy didn't wait for her to finish. He was already moving. The elevator ride felt agonizingly slow. The moment the doors opened, Jeremy stepped out, striding down the hallway with purpose. 2 security personnel flanked him, their radios crackling with updates from the medical team already inside. As soon as he entered the suite, the metallic scent of antiseptic and panic filled his lungs. A paramedic knelt beside the unconscious heir of the Green family, checking his vitals while another prepared a stretcher. His skin was ashen, his breathing shallow. Jeremy's eyes swept the room. The signs were unmistakable: an overturned glass, a small plastic bag crumpled near the edge of the nightstand. His jaw tightened. He turned to one of his security heads. Was he alone when he checked in? The man hesitated. There were guests earlier in the evening, but they left before midnight. No signs of forced entry. "Have the security tapes pulled," Jeremy ordered. "I want to know who was in and out of this room in the last 24 hours. As the paramedics loaded the heir onto the stretcher, Jeremy stepped aside, watching as they wheeled him out. The moment the door shut behind them, he exhaled slowly, pressing a hand to his forehead. The problem was no longer hypothetical. Drugs were inside his hotel, and they had nearly killed someone. By the time Jeremy returned to his office, it was well past midnight. The city stretched beyond the window, alive with distant lights, oblivious to the battle unfolding behind closed doors. Juan sat in one of the chairs across from his desk, his small figure hunched, his fingers idly tracing patterns along the armrest. He didn't look up when Jeremy walked in. "You heard," Jeremy said, closing the door behind him. Juan nodded, his posture tightening. "It was them, wasn't it?" Jeremy sat down, exhaling slowly. He didn't ask who them meant. He already knew. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I intend to find out." Juan's lips pressed together, his fingers curling into the fabric of his hoodie. "It was the same," he said finally. "The way they acted, the way they passed things off like they didn't matter. It's the same as before." Jeremy watched him carefully. Juan had gone pale the moment the news of the overdose broke. Now, as he sat across from him, the weight of old memories was written all over his face. "I didn't know," Juan murmured. "I didn't know what I was carrying." Jeremy leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. "I know that, Juan." The boy swallowed hard. "But I helped them." Jeremy's voice was steady, without knowing. Juan looked down, his shoulders drawing inward. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the distant hum of the city beyond the windows. Then Jeremy reached across the desk and flicked a coin between his fingers. The soft clink of metal against wood broke the silence. "Every choice we make leads somewhere," he said. "Sometimes we don't realize where until it's too late. But that doesn't mean we don't get to decide what happens next." Juan glanced up, wary but listening. "You made a choice when you ran," Jeremy continued. "That was the first step. Now you get to decide what comes after." Juan hesitated. Then finally, he nodded. Jeremy leaned back. "I'm handling this. You don't need to carry it." Juan swallowed but didn't argue. For now, that was enough. The next morning, Jeremy stood in the security room, watching the footage from the previous night. The video showed Green's suite door opening at various points throughout the evening. Some faces were familiar: guests, hotel staff. Others weren't. Then, at 10:45 p.m., a figure entered. A woman, dressed in an expensive coat, her posture confident, as if she belonged there. She handed something off, quick, discreet. A package. Jeremy's stomach twisted. He turned to his head of security. "Find her." That afternoon, he sat in a boardroom with the hotel's legal team, going over protocols, media strategies, and the potential fallout of the situation. His mind, however, was elsewhere. If this was connected to Kayla and Tyler, then Juan wasn't just a victim of circumstance. He had been caught in the middle of something bigger, something that had infiltrated Jeremy's own business without him realizing. He clenched his fists. This wasn't just about protecting Juan anymore. It was about stopping something before it could spread. Later that night, as Jeremy pulled into the driveway, Juan was waiting on the porch steps. His expression was unreadable, but his fingers tapped anxiously against his knee. Jeremy stepped out of the car and walked over. "You should be inside." Juan shook his head. "I can't." Jeremy sighed, taking a seat beside him. The cool night air wrapped around them, the distant sounds of the city a low hum in the background. "You were right," Jeremy admitted. "It's bigger than I thought." Juan stared at the ground. "What are you going to do?" Jeremy exhaled. "Find out who's behind it, and then shut it down." Juan was silent for a long time. Then, finally, he said, "Can I help?" Jeremy glanced at him. The kid was smart, too smart. He knew more than he let on, and deep down, Jeremy knew that Juan wouldn't be content just sitting on the sidelines. Still. "This isn't your problem to fix," Jeremy said evenly. Juan didn't argue, but his jaw tightened. Jeremy ran a hand through his hair, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. "I'll handle this," he said again. "You just worry about yourself." Juan exhaled, rubbing his hands together for warmth. He nodded, but there was something in his eyes, something unsettled. Jeremy had the sinking feeling that Juan wasn't going to sit this one out, and something told him that before this was over, they were both going to find themselves in deeper than they had ever expected. The city pulsed outside Jeremy's office window, the neon lights flickering against the night sky. Inside, the room was quiet, except for the steady ticking of the clock. Juan sat across from him, his small hands clenched together, his jaw tight with determination. "I want to go back," Juan said, breaking the silence. Jeremy leaned back in his chair, his fingers interlaced as he studied the boy. "Not an option." Juan exhaled sharply. "It's the only way." Jeremy shook his head. "You don't need to do this. I've already handed over evidence to CPS. The police will deal with them soon. They're not in jail yet." Juan's voice was firm, sharper than before. "They're still out there, still doing the same things. If I go back, I can find out what they're planning. I can help." Jeremy exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to stay calm. The kid was smart, too smart, but this was dangerous. "You think they won't be suspicious?" he asked. "They won't," Juan said, his expression unreadable. "I know how to act. I know what they expect." Jeremy's gut twisted. The fact that Juan knew how to manipulate the situation, how to slip back into that world so seamlessly, made his stomach churn. "Why do you really want to do this?" Jeremy asked, his voice quieter now. Juan looked at him then, his dark eyes steady. "Because I need to end this too." Jeremy sighed, running a hand through his hair. He wanted to say no. Everything in him screamed to keep the kid out of it. But Juan wasn't asking for permission. He was making a choice. And Jeremy knew deep down that if he didn't let him do this, the kid would find a way to do it alone. "Fine," Jeremy said finally, his voice laced with reluctance. "But we do this my way. If anything seems off, I'm pulling you out. No arguments." Juan nodded, but Jeremy wasn't convinced he'd actually listen. 2 nights later, Juan stood outside the rundown house where he had once lived. The place hadn't changed. The paint was still peeling, the porch light flickered weakly, and the air smelled of cigarettes and stale beer. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he lifted his fist and knocked. A moment later, the door swung open. Kayla stood there, her face twisting in surprise, before it shifted into something darker, calculating. Well, well, she drawled. Look who finally came crawling back. Juan forced himself to shrug, to keep his expression neutral. Didn't have anywhere else to go. Kayla smirked, stepping aside to let him in. You finally got some sense in that thick skull of yours. The moment he stepped inside, the familiar stench of cheap liquor and sweat hit him. The air felt thick, suffocating. Tyler was sitting on the couch, a beer in one hand, his boots propped up on the coffee table. He barely glanced up. Took you long enough. Juan swallowed down his disgust. I was scared, he muttered. I thought you'd be mad. Tyler snorted. Damn right we're mad. You put us in a tough spot, kid. Kayla shut the door behind him, locking it with a soft click. You owe us, she said, her voice smooth but laced with something dangerous. And now you're going to make it up to us. Juan forced himself to nod. Yeah. Whatever you need. Kayla's lips curled. Good boy. For the next 2 days, Juan did exactly what he had done before. He listened, he watched, and he memorized. Tyler still ran things like he always had, barking orders while Kayla handled the money. They talked in code, but Juan had been around long enough to understand what they really meant. The deliveries were still happening. The exchanges were still going on. And worse, some of their buyers were connected to Jeremy's hotel. Juan's stomach twisted the first time he overheard a name he recognized. A wealthy businessman, someone he had seen shaking Jeremy's hand in the lobby, was one of their regulars. This wasn't just a small operation, it was bigger than he thought. And he was running out of time. On the third night, Tyler tossed a package onto the kitchen table. You're going to take this one, he said, his voice firm. We need someone they won't suspect. Juan forced himself to nod. Where? Tyler pulled out his phone, showing him an address. Juan's stomach clenched. It was the back entrance of Jeremy's hotel. He kept his face neutral, acting like it meant nothing, but his hands curled into fists beneath the table. Kayla was watching him, her eyes sharp. You're not going to run off again, are you? No, Juan said immediately. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Good. Meanwhile, back at the hotel, Jeremy sat across from Elliot, the investigator's laptop open between them. You're going to want to see this, Elliot said, pulling up the enhanced footage from the security cameras. The screen flickered, showing the woman in the expensive coat entering the suite the night of the overdose. Elliot zoomed in, and Jeremy's stomach dropped. Beneath the heavy makeup, the perfectly styled hair, it was Kayla, disguised, but unmistakably her. Jeremy exhaled, leaning back in his chair. We have her, he said. Elliot nodded. And with Juan in the house, we might get even more. Jeremy's jaw clenched. He didn't like it. But if this was going to end, they had to see it through, even if it meant letting Juan walk straight into the fire. Juan knew the moment he stepped out the door that he was being followed, not by Kayla or Tyler, but by Jeremy's men. He had caught a glimpse of them in the alley across the street, the way they lingered just out of reach, but never too far. Good. He tightened his hand with a determination. By tomorrow, this will be over, one way or another. The night air was thick with humidity, the faint scent of gasoline and damp asphalt lingering as Juan slipped out the back door of Kayla and Tyler's house. His pulse was steady, controlled, though his fingers trembled slightly as he pulled the burner phone from his hoodie pocket. He pressed a single button. Jeremy answered immediately. Talk to me. Juan kept his voice low. It's happening tomorrow, early morning, same place they always use, behind your hotel, 5:30 a.m. Jeremy exhaled. Are you sure? I heard it from Tyler himself. Juan's throat felt dry. This is the last one. They're moving everything. Jeremy's silence stretched through the line. Then, good. Get out of there. Now. Juan hesitated. I can't. You've done your part, Juan. Jeremy's voice was firm, controlled, but Juan could hear the frustration beneath it. I'm pulling you out. If I leave now, they'll know something's up. Juan swallowed hard. They need to believe I'm on their side until the very last second. Jeremy muttered a curse under his breath. You'd better be right about this. I am. A long pause. Then Jeremy said, The second it's over, I want you out. Don't try to be a hero. Juan forced a smirk. Too late for that. The call ended. Juan tucked the phone back into his pocket, took a deep breath, and turned toward the house. Tomorrow, everything would change. 4:45 a.m. Behind the hotel, the alley was quiet, save for the occasional hum of a distant car or the rustling of wind against dumpsters. Dim light flickered from the street lamps, their glow barely reaching the back entrance of the hotel. Juan stood near the loading dock, his hoodie pulled low over his face. He clutched the package tightly, his fingers digging into the paper as he waited. Footsteps. Tyler and Kayla emerged from the shadows, their postures relaxed, confident. Two men followed closely behind them, men Juan had never seen before. Juan's stomach twisted. This wasn't just another transaction. This was their exit plan. Right on time, Tyler muttered, flicking his cigarette to the ground. Thought you might get cold feet. Juan forced himself to shrug. You said you needed me. Kayla smirked. That's what I like to hear. She turned toward one of the men. You got the money? The man reached into his coat, pulling out a thick envelope. You got the product? Juan's heart pounded. He knew what was coming next. He stepped forward, holding out the package. And then, a voice cut through the darkness. Drop it! Red and blue lights exploded through the alley. Chaos erupted. Tyler cursed, reaching for something inside his jacket, but the sound of a gun being cocked froze him in place. Don't even think about it, a voice barked. Officers swarmed the scene, weapons drawn, shouts filling the air as they took control. Kayla spun toward Juan, realization dawning too late. You little... A pair of officers grabbed her arms, yanking her back. Juan barely moved. Tyler thrashed as they pushed him against the alley wall. You set us up, he roared. His eyes burned into Juan. You think this is over? You think you're safe? Juan didn't flinch. He met Tyler's glare head-on. I think you're done. Tyler spat at the ground. Juan watched as they hauled him away. He exhaled, his breath shaky, his adrenaline crashing all at once. A firm hand landed on his shoulder. He turned. Jeremy stood there, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jeremy said, You okay? Juan nodded, though his knees felt weak. Jeremy studied him. Then, quietly, Good. Let's go home. The hotel was locked down for hours, officers combing through every floor, every room, every possible connection. Several guests were questioned. 2 were arrested. Those not involved were compensated for room charges and hotel service incentives to appease customers. By noon, the mess had been contained. Jeremy stood in his office, his back to the city skyline, listening to the final report from the lead detective. The operation was bigger than we thought, the detective admitted. Kayla and Tyler weren't just small-time dealers. They were part of a supply chain. Jeremy's jaw clenched. And my hotel? We've ruled out internal involvement, the detective assured him. You've been cooperative. We'll make sure the media knows that. Jeremy exhaled. And the kid? The detective glanced toward the doorway. Juan stood just outside, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. He's free to go, the detective said. Honestly, he gave us more than half our leads. Smart kid. Jeremy smirked faintly. Yeah, I know. The detective nodded, then left. Silence settled. Juan stepped into the office, his gaze meeting Jeremy's. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then Juan said, So what now? Jeremy leaned against his desk, arms crossed. That depends. Juan raised an eyebrow. On? Jeremy's smirk deepened. You still want to work here? Juan blinked. Then, despite everything, a small, tired smile crossed his face. "I think I'd be pretty good at it." Jeremy chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, I think so too." For the first time in a long time, Juan felt something he hadn't felt before. Safe. The courtroom was silent, except for the quiet shuffle of papers and the low murmur of attorneys preparing their cases. The walls were tall, imposing, lined with oak paneling that seemed to swallow sound. The air smelled of coffee and old books, a stark contrast to the weight of the trial unfolding inside. Juan sat at the witness stand, his small hands resting on the polished wooden surface. His chest felt tight, but he forced himself to sit up straight. Across the room, Kayla and Tyler sat behind the defense table, their faces unreadable. But Juan knew better than to mistake their silence for remorse. He took a slow breath. He had practiced this, with Jeremy, with the court-appointed attorney. But now that he was here, the words felt heavier. The prosecutor stepped forward. "Juan, can you tell the court how you came to live with the defendants, Kayla and Tyler Morgan?" Juan's fingers twitched against the wood. He kept his eyes forward. "They took me in after my parents died." "And how were you treated in their care?" Juan swallowed. "Badly. Can you clarify?" Juan hesitated. He didn't want to relive it, didn't want to pull those memories back into focus. But he had come this far. He couldn't stop now. They hit me," he said finally. "Mostly Tyler. He got angry a lot. Sometimes he'd make me deliver things for him. Packages. I didn't know what was inside at first." The courtroom was still. The prosecutor nodded. "And when you did find out?" Juan's jaw clenched. "I ran. And I met Jeremy. We accidentally discovered the truth." "Because you feared for your safety?" Juan met her gaze. "Because I didn't want to be like them." The prosecutor gave him a small, reassuring nod. Across the room, Tyler scoffed, muttering something under his breath. Kayla, for the first time, looked at Juan directly. Her expression was unreadable, but Juan felt something cold twist inside him. She wasn't sorry. She never had been. The judge adjusted her glasses. "Does the defense wish to cross-examine?" Tyler's lawyer stood, straightening his tie. He was young, maybe in his early 30s, and he gave Juan a tight-lipped smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Juan," he said, voice smooth, "you mentioned that you didn't know what was inside these packages. So, isn't it possible that you simply misunderstood the nature of these deliveries?" Juan stared at him. "No." The lawyer's expression flickered. "You're sure?" Juan leaned forward slightly. "I was the one carrying them. I was the one who saw the people picking them up. And I was the one who ran, because I knew something was wrong." Silence. The lawyer cleared his throat, then sat back down. No further questions. The verdict came swiftly. Kayla and Tyler were found guilty on multiple counts: child endangerment, drug trafficking, money laundering. The sentences were heavy, longer than Juan had expected. He should have felt relieved. Instead, as he sat outside the courthouse steps, staring at the passing cars, he just felt tired. Jeremy sat beside him, silent for a long while. Finally, he said, "You did good in there." Juan shrugged. "They're gone now." "They are." Juan let out a slow breath. "So why doesn't it feel like enough?" Jeremy leaned back, resting his elbows on the steps. "Because closure isn't simple. It's not just about them getting what they deserve. It's about you figuring out what comes next." Juan nodded absently. He didn't know what that meant yet, but he wanted to. Jeremy didn't waste time. Within days of the trial, new security policies were rolled out across all his hotels. Background checks were tightened. Staff was retrained on how to spot illicit activities. Guest lists were scrutinized with sharper eyes. He refused to let something like this happen again, not under his watch. Juan watched the changes unfold from the sidelines. One afternoon, He wandered into the security office, watching as new surveillance protocols were tested. One of the managers noticed him lingering and motioned him over. "Curious?" the man asked. Juan hesitated, then nodded. The manager smirked. "Come on then. I'll show you how we keep this place clean." Juan followed, listening intently as the man walked him through the system. How they monitored movement. How they flagged unusual activity. For the first time in weeks, Juan felt like he was part of something. Not just a kid trying to survive, but someone with a purpose. Later that evening, Jeremy found Juan on the rooftop terrace, staring out over the city. The lights flickered like stars, stretching endlessly into the horizon. Jeremy leaned against the railing. "Long day?" Juan shrugged. "Not bad." Jeremy glanced at him. "You're thinking about something." Juan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What happens now?" Jeremy studied him. "To you?" Juan nodded. Jeremy exhaled. "That depends." Juan turned to face him fully. "On what?" Jeremy's smirk was faint. "On what you decide." For a long time, Juan had only ever been given orders, told where to go, what to do, who to be. Now, for the first time, the choice was his, and for the first time he wasn't afraid of it. The courtroom was smaller than before, less daunting but just as significant. Instead of cold glares and accusations, today there was warmth, hope. Jeremy sat beside Juan at the polished wooden table, his hands folded in front of him as the judge skimmed through the documents. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant hum of city traffic filtering through the thick windows. Juan's fingers curled into the fabric of his hoodie. He had been here before, in rooms where his fate was decided without his voice ever being heard. But today was different. Today, he wasn't being handed off. He was being chosen. The judge finally looked up, adjusting her glasses. She was an older woman, her expression stern but not unkind. "Mr. Howard," she began, her voice steady, "you understand the responsibilities you're undertaking by filing for the legal adoption of Juan Morgan?" Jeremy nodded once. "I do." "You are prepared to provide him with a stable home, education, and any necessary support for his future?" "Absolutely." The judge turned her gaze to Juan. "And you, Juan, do you understand what this means?" Juan swallowed, nodding. "Yes, ma'am." She softened slightly. "This is your choice." He glanced at Jeremy, who met his gaze without hesitation. "It's what I want," Juan said, his voice steady. A pause. Then the judge picked up her pen, signing her name at the bottom of the document. "Then it's done." The gavel came down with a decisive thud. Juan was no longer alone. The house felt different now. It wasn't just a place he was staying. It was home. Boxes of school supplies sat stacked on his desk, a backpack leaning against the chair. In his closet, instead of mismatched second-hand clothes, there were neatly folded shirts and jeans that actually fit. For the first time in his life, Juan had something permanent. Something that was his. The first day of school. Jeremy had insisted on dropping him off himself. Juan wasn't thrilled about it. "You don't have to walk me in," he muttered, shifting his backpack higher on his shoulder as they pulled up to the school gates. Jeremy smirked. "You embarrassed already?" Juan rolled his eyes. "I'm not 6. Jeremy chuckled but didn't push. "All right, go on then. I'll pick you up at 3. Juan hesitated, then nodded, stepping out of the car. He had expected the stares, the whispers. New kid. But he kept his head down and walked inside. By lunch, he had learned 2 things. 1. School was harder than he remembered. 2. He wasn't used to this. Sitting in a room with other kids, raising his hand, having to ask for permission to speak. By the end of the day, his head ached. When Jeremy pulled up to the curb, Juan slid into the passenger seat, letting out a long breath. "How was it?" Jeremy asked. Juan shrugged. "Weird." Jeremy smirked. Weird good or weird bad? I don't know yet. Jeremy nodded, as if that answer was good enough. Homework. A few days later, Juan sat at the kitchen table, frowning at his math book. The numbers blurred together, refusing to make sense. Jeremy leaned against the counter, sipping his coffee. Need help? No. A pause. Yeah. Jeremy smirked, pulling out a chair. All right, let's see what you got. Juan hesitated before sliding the book toward him. Jeremy scanned the page, tapping a finger against the table. Okay, let's break this down. They worked through the problems slowly, Juan still hesitant, but listening. At some point, Jeremy realized he was enjoying it, helping, teaching, being someone to this kid. DAD. It slipped out one evening. They were in the living room, watching a documentary Jeremy had picked. Juan had been half listening, half dozing off, curled into the corner of the couch. Jeremy reached for the remote. You want to watch something else? Juan mumbled. Nah, it's fine, Dad. Jeremy froze. Juan blinked, suddenly wide awake. A thick silence filled the space between them. He looked at Jeremy, his expression caught between panic and realization. Jeremy didn't let him backtrack. He just gave a small, slow nod. Okay, he said, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Juan swallowed, then nodded back. Neither of them said anything else. They didn't need to. The morning air carried the scent of fresh coffee and sun-warmed pavement as Juan stepped into the hotel lobby. The towering glass windows let in golden streaks of sunlight, casting long reflections against the polished floors. The place was alive with the quiet murmur of early guests, the rhythmic clicking of heels, and the crisp voices of receptionists handling morning check-ins. Juan adjusted his uniform, black slacks, a crisp white shirt, and a neatly pinned name tag that simply read, Juan. No last name, no title. He wanted it that way. This summer, he wasn't here as Jeremy Howard's adopted son. He was just another employee, and that was exactly what he wanted. His first task was at the entrance, greeting guests as they arrived. Welcome to the Howard Grand, he said, standing beside the doorman. Can I help with your luggage? Most guests responded with polite nods, some murmuring a distracted thank you. Others barely glanced at him, their attention fixed on their phones. He didn't mind. Then, a middle-aged man with an expensive suit and an impatient expression stepped out of a black town car. He barely looked at Juan before shoving a heavy suitcase toward him. Be careful with that, the man snapped. It's worth more than your paycheck. Juan clenched his jaw, but forced himself to nod. Of course, sir. He lifted the suitcase with ease, walking toward the concierge. As he placed it down gently, he caught the subtle nod of approval from one of the senior bellboys. Respect wasn't handed out. It had to be earned. He understood that better than most. By midday, Juan had helped with check-ins, delivered luggage, and even assisted in setting up a conference room for a high-profile event. The other employees had started acknowledging him, not as the owner's kid, but as part of the team. Luis, one of the concierge attendants, clapped him on the back as they passed in the hallway. Not bad, kid. Thought you'd quit by lunch. Juan smirked. Still standing. Amazing. Luis grinned. You sure you don't want to just sit in an office somewhere? You know, do rich kid things? Juan rolled his eyes. Not my style. Luis chuckled. All right then, let's see if you survive the afternoon rush. The lobby turned into a whirlwind of movement as noon checkouts clashed with new arrivals. Juan rushed between stations, carrying suitcases, delivering messages, and even running up 6 flights of stairs when an elevator broke down. Sweat lined his collar. His feet ached, but he didn't stop. By the time things slowed, he stood near the front desk, catching his breath. A guest approached. A woman in her 40s, holding a stack of brochures. Young man, she said kindly, where's the best place for dinner around here? Juan hesitated, then rattled off 3 solid recommendations. The woman smiled. "You're very knowledgeable for someone so young." "I work here," he said simply, and for the first time, he truly felt like he did. By evening, Juan made his way up to the executive floor, pushing open the familiar office door. Jeremy sat behind his desk, reviewing reports, but looked up as Juan entered. "You're late," Jeremy said, arching an eyebrow. Juan flopped into the chair across from him, exhaling dramatically. "I think my feet are permanently broken." Jeremy smirked. "Tough first day?" Juan shrugged. "More like real." Jeremy leaned back in his chair. "And?" Juan hesitated, then nodded. "I liked it." Jeremy's smirk softened into something else, something proud. "Good." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Juan stretched, cracking his knuckles. "So, Dad," he said, testing the word out again, but this time with ease. "What's for dinner?" Jeremy blinked, then chuckled. "You hungry or just trying to avoid going back to work?" Juan grinned. "Both." Jeremy shook his head, already reaching for his phone. "Fine. Let's get something good." And as they walked out together, side by side, there was no doubt. They weren't just billionaire and rescued boy. They were father and son. And that was all that mattered. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.